Good afternoon, everybody. It's Wendy Perry here from Workforce Blueprint. I'm the Head Workforce Planner, and it's my very great pleasure to be hosting a webinar this afternoon with the Australian Workforce and Productivity Agency, where we're going to be treated to an explanation of the National Workforce Development Strategy and also some insight into a range of other projects, including the sectoral research that AWPA is undertaking. We do have opportunity throughout today's format, if you like, where we'll be putting those questions back to colleagues from AWPA to respond to. So that's how it will work, and just bear with me as well whilst I'm responding to your questions and your chats, because with over 100 people online, you can imagine that the question and chat sort of goes off, and I'll have a chance to get back to you as much as I possibly can through the session today. So let me introduce colleagues from AWPA who are going to be presenting today. First of all, and our initial presenter is Robin Shreeve. Robin is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Workforce and Productivity Agency. We also have Kathy Barnes online, and she's the Acting Director for the Workforce Development Policy. And Jacinta Galuzzo, who's the Director for the Sectoral Research Reports. Can I say thank you from Workforce Blueprint, but also in terms of the attendees. I think it's fantastic that AWPA has agreed to run a webinar like this to make the information incredibly accessible to people, and particularly to our database, who are clients, associates, people very interested in workforce development and planning. So Robin, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Wendy. It's a great pleasure for us to do this afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity. AWPA's key role, as mandated in our legislation, is to provide advice to the government on Australia's future workforce development and skill needs. And we do this via a range of different activities. The agency's focus really is policy, and our major policies are things like the National Workforce Development Strategy, but we've also done some policy advice to the government in terms of Skills for Prosperity, which was work on the VET sector, as well as Foundations for the Future. The other thing that we have in terms of policy advice, we have a role in skilled migration. We do the skilled occupation list, or provide advice on the skilled occupation list for the government, and that covers the independent skilled migration program, which isn't 457s or employer sponsors. It's for people who want to come here under their own steam. To achieve all of this, we obviously do a lot of research, but we also do research in its own right. So one of our research interests, for example, is skills utilisation. It's fine if skills are developed, but those skills have got to be utilised, otherwise it's a waste of resource for the individual, who's obviously paid some money and certainly expended some time in getting those skills, for the employer and the government who's sponsored them as well. So skills utilisation is a great concern of our board. Recently we've picked up the responsibility of providing advice about the National Workforce Development Funds. My board sets the priorities for the funds and also makes allocations to the industry skills councils, who are the main conduits for the fund in terms of industry, but also in the budget recently, Skills Connects, which is going to be run through Innovation State Officers, is also going to have a role in terms of employer responsive funding. And then lastly, you're going to hear from Jacinta this afternoon, we do some workforce development needs, we do some sectoral studies. We've always done the resources sector ever since we began at Skills Australia, but recently we've embarked on some new studies which I'll ask Jacinta to talk to you about as well. We talked about the research that we do and some of the themes that come up. Clearly productivity and workforce participation is of great interest to us. We all know the productivity challenge that we face. In the 1990s there were a number of structural reforms in Australia, and also we had the impact of ICT. People in offices probably had a desktop computer on their desk, and that increased productivity significantly, as well as some of the macroeconomic things like freeing up the dollar. In the next decade our productivity slowed down, but we didn't notice so much economically because we had the resources boom and we all had a pay rise from that, and that contributed significantly to national wealth. As the resources boom, we hope, continues but comes off a bit, we need to replace that wealth generation through increased productivity. And clearly there's a relationship between productivity and skills. People with higher level skills tend to be more productive and more innovative. Workforce participation is also absolutely critical. As Kathy will explain in the strategy, my board has an aspirational target of achieving a workforce participation rate for people aged over 15 of 69%. It's currently running at 65%. Now clearly, people who are in the workforce tend to be healthier and happier and also wealthier, and so is the whole economy, because the more people in work, the more tax income the government gets and the less we spend on social security, but there are those individual social and economic benefits as well. Obviously we have a look at different occupations and skill needs, but going down to the bottom left-hand quadrant, the quality of work is something that we are very interested in. We're currently partnering with Curtin University doing a research study into the quality of work, and we're looking at both extrinsic factors such as pay and, more importantly, intrinsic factors such as the degree of autonomy a worker might have, which impact on their perception of the quality of the job that they're doing. And talking about quality, we've also done some work on the quality of vocational education and training. Now, the board would be the first to recognise that we have many fine RTOs and providers out there, but there have been reports from people like the Productivity Commission which have highlighted some inconsistency in the quality of providers. And obviously, if the system's credentials are to remain current with industry, we have to know that a Cert 3 in one occupational area issued by one provider is of a similar standard to a Cert 3 issued by another provider. So we're interested in consistency and we're interested in quality, and when we do our consultations, for example, people talk to us about some of the issues in high-risk qualifications, such as the Certificate 4 in Training and Education, and like many other people, we've recently done a submission to the National Skills Standards Committee about those types of issues. Obviously, one of the things that we do is attempt to give some idea of what the future might hold. Now, labour market forecasting is notoriously problematic. The Soviets had many thousands of staff working in the Kremlin trying to do it, and they couldn't do it in a planned economy, so we have to have certain principles if we're going to do it in a national level in a democratic free market economy. And the three conceptual pillars that we use are these. The first one is the notion of specialised occupations. My board believes that the labour market at a general level works quite well. However, there are certain occupations where there's a higher risk of market failure. And those occupations are the ones that might, for example, meet such criteria of having a long lead time. So we know in Australia it takes 5 years to train and qualify as a dentist, and it will take 4 years to train and qualify as an electrician. And those qualifications aren't substitutable by anything else. So if you have a shortage of dentists or a shortage of electricians, you're going to have a fairly long pipeline, and the only other alternate source of supply is going to be through skilled migration. Now, that's not true of all occupations. For example, managers have fairly generic skills, and managers tend to shift around different industries. So somebody who's been a manager in the hospitality industry can use those skills in, say, a service situation. Now, both types of occupations are critically important, and it's nothing to do with the funding of the training for those occupations. Both specialised and non-specialised occupations need government funding. But in terms of planning, my board believes that we should concentrate on those specialised occupations where the qualifications aren't substitutable or they take a long time to train, as those areas where we need to concentrate on. Our second conceptual pillar is the whole notion of scenarios. We have to do some forecasting, but we'd rather not do one linear forecast. Rather, what we attempt to do is to do some scenarios so we can have some alternate visions of the future. And that gives us the opportunity to stress test our policy recommendations against a range of future scenarios, future options. It also enables us to identify what is common across all scenarios. So the board is a great believer in looking at different scenarios so we don't put our eggs in one forecast. And finally, we believe in demand-driven funding provided certain preconditions are met. And one of those preconditions is that you sort out quality and the market also has good information. And what this means is that the board thinks it's more expeditious to fund clients, whether they be individual students or individual enterprises, rather than providers directly. Now, years ago in the 1990s, people felt that you could put everything into a Monash Syntec model, and if you put all the factors in, it could tell you that you needed 15 apprentice places in automotive in Grafton. Now, we think that that wasn't particularly effective, and we believe that the auto industry in Grafton has got a better idea of what its needs are than, say, a centralised bureaucrat in Sydney. Now, obviously there needs to be checks and balances on all of this, but the general principle arises that we actually think it's better to be bottom-up rather than overtly and totally top-down. So they're the three conceptual pillars that we use in terms of doing our work. The notion of specialised occupations, using scenarios, and using demand-driven funding. What I'd like to do now is to move to any quick questions before we move to Kathy Barnes, and in terms of going through our latest bit of work, which is the National Workforce Development Strategy. So Wendy, I believe you're going to ask me any questions that come up.
Sure thing. Thanks, Robin. So far, I can't see that anyone's typed any questions or comments in just yet, so we might need to let that sit with people for a while, Robin, and for them to have the opportunity to ask those questions as we get a bit further on in the session. If there is any attendee online that does have a quick question, just feel free to pop that into the question chat box for me and I'll relay that to Robin. So thanks, Robin, and what we'll do now is ask Kathy to talk about the National Workforce Development Strategy. So Robin, I'm just going to mute your mic. Kathy, I've just unmuted your mic now, so do you want to say hello?
So there's quite a lot of factors that we have to take into account when we're developing a national workforce development strategy. I was actually watching a program a few months ago about the town of Scarborough in England, and I realised that they were doing workforce planning a long time ago, where they had in the summer, of course, there was lots of tourism, and they wondered what they should do in the winter. So they did coach building in the winter, and they actually brought people in from different places, and they kind of ran two arrangements at the one time. Now, if we're thinking about the kind of factors that we need to take into account when we're doing workforce development for the next couple of decades, you can see from this slide that there's quite a lot of different things that we have to consider. Work arrangements, for instance, are changing. Businesses are sourcing skills as and when they need them, and I think a very good example of that is through crowdsourcing. And as we also know, cloud computing is becoming more and more common as a business tool. Then with globalisation, there's definitely a very big demand for flexibility and mobility coming from employers and employees, and that's going to impact the demand for high-level skills to 2025. The role of Asia is another big one, and we know, for example, that the growing middle class in Asia is going to offer some potential benefits for Australian industry in their demand for goods and services. So that's another important factor. And then another one, again, is that at the moment only half Australians stay in their jobs for more than 5 years. So it means that that's really important to build adaptive capacity across the transitions of an entire working life. Robin's already explained to us why the agency takes a scenario approach to workforce development. And this slide gives you a bit of a picture of what the 4 scenarios are that we've developed for this particular piece of work. They're not meant to be predictions, as Robin explained, but they do give us a range of futures that we can plan for. So if we start at the top left, the long boom is a scenario where we see things continue pretty much as they are at the moment. So the high demand for resources traded with China and other countries continues, but the downside of that is that some industries that are exposed to the high terms of trade go through structural adjustment, and of course we're seeing that very much in Australia at the moment in the impacts on manufacturing, education and training and so on. The smart recovery, next one to the right, in this one the challenges facing Europe and the US affect financial markets for a few years to come, perhaps to about 2014, 2015, and after that growth improves and Australia is able to establish our new knowledge economy. Of course, we're seeing some of that at the moment with the crisis in Cyprus. In terms of trade shock, in this one, resources prices fall, mainly due to increased supply from other countries. That means that the Australian dollar falls, and we're able to move to a broader-based economy. And again, we're seeing some aspects of that now with the drop in resources prices. And then ring of fire, the fourth scenario. That's the one where it's a risky world and there's multiple shocks. So there's economic shocks, there are a sort of series of environmental shocks, tsunamis, rising sea levels and so on. And then there's also geopolitical shocks, particularly in relation to our region and the South China Sea. So our planning, we decided, would be based primarily on the three higher growth scenarios, and we've treated ring of fire as a little bit of an outlier. And you can see in this slide that some of the common areas are the ageing population, the importance of Asia, and impacts of technology and climate change. One of the things we should bear in mind, of course, is that the populations of other countries are ageing too. In Japan, for instance, there's already 32% of the population aged 60 or over, so other countries are also experiencing the same issues. So in terms of positioning the Australian workforce for the future, we need to act across a range of areas, and that we've really structured our report to reflect that range of areas that we're seeing the need for action in. So the increasing demand for higher skills is really a critical priority, and I'll come back to that. We consider how to improve productivity in the workplace through enhancing leadership and management skills. To improve social inclusion, we want to see more investment in wraparound support to help people get into the labour force and to meet that aspirational target of 69% participation that Robin's already mentioned. Of course, at the moment it's close to 65%. And in order to do that, one of the really critical issues is addressing the low levels of language literacy and numeracy in the population. Adaptive capacity in the tertiary sector and for individuals is going to be critical in a changing world, and quality remains a key issue. But in the end, our message is that investing in skills will pay for itself. Our modelling shows increasing industry demand for higher level qualifications. So don't be put off by this complicated table, because what we're looking at really is a list of qualifications down the left-hand side, and then the average annual change in the demand for those qualifications across the scenarios. So if you just look at the red box in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that in the three high growth scenarios, the average annual change in the need for higher qualifications is really growing at least 3%. Over the years to 2025, and that's the figure that we've based our recommendations on. Currently, just under 60% of Australia's working population holds a post-school qualification, but in those three high growth scenarios, we're expecting that to increase to 70% or more by 2025. Demand for qualifications is going to be strongest at the higher qualification levels, and that's advanced diploma and diploma, but lower qualifications are important too, and our board always wants to stress this, that those lower level qualifications help to increase labour force participation and act as a pathway to higher qualifications. The modelling that we've done gives us a glimpse of Australia's future employment landscape. So interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, Healthcare and social assistance is right up there in terms of industries with the largest increase in people employed, followed by professional, scientific and technical services and education and training. By 2025, we're expecting that there'll actually be 1 million more professionals in the workforce, and that 38% of the workforce will be made up of managers and professionals. So it's sort of more of the same, but quite a dramatic increase all the same. And with this picture in mind, we're recommending that Australian government support achieving a minimum 3% growth in tertiary qualifications to 2025. And now we're coming on to that issue of participation, which Robin's already alluded to as being an important one for our agency. People aged 25 to 64 holding a qualification are nearly 20% more likely to be in the labour force than those who don't hold one. So if we want to lift participation in the labour force, we're going to need more educational support and wraparound services for less advantaged sectors of the population. We want to keep our older workers, and so we have a focus on retaining those in the workforce. And we also need to help people who participate in in occupations that may not have been traditional for their gender. For example, supposing you had somebody who's worked in the automotive manufacturing all their life. This is quite a pretty common example for now. So that person's going to lose their job, perhaps with Ford. How are we going to be able to get them into another occupation in another industry where there might be openings? That industry might be, for instance, healthcare, and that's been a traditionally feminine occupation. So we need to be able to assist those kind of transitions. And really a key factor in improving participation is raising language literacy and numeracy levels. We know that many Australians suffer disadvantage because their levels of language literacy and numeracy are not as high. And this doesn't mean that they're necessarily people who can't read or they can't add up, but that their levels are not high enough for the complex needs of the modern workplace. You know, a good example of that would be, can they read an OH&S manual? Can they leave a message for somebody who, you know, about a machine that might have broken down and somebody's coming in on the next shift? So those kind of practical workplace issues. And the strategy calls for greater public awareness of the magnitude of the problem. And also we think we need better information. So we are recommending a 5-yearly national survey so that we know, are we making progress or not, what's going on in this area that everybody is so keen to see real progress in. So we're really looking at how can we enable individuals in the tertiary system to be more adaptive. And there's a number of aspects of this. Looking at the question of work-ready graduates to start with, we know that when people do workplace surveys, employers routinely rank work experience as among the most important attributes they need in their staff, and this they're asking for even among new graduates. We've identified what we call an experience gap between the people who've just got their qualifications and those organisations and employers that they're hoping to work for. So we're pretty interested in supporting transitions from study and training to work, and particularly the possibilities of expanding work-integrated learning. And we see real benefit in collaboration between industry and government and providers to expand opportunities here, and perhaps to support further development of professional cadetships. Careers advice is another important aspect of helping individuals to be more flexible, and that's particularly the case now that we're moving towards a demand-led system in terms of student choice. How can they make those choices that will help them to move into a career that's not only satisfying but also where there are openings for them? Another aspect is really creating flexible pathways that allow people to move seamlessly back and forth between vet and higher education. And we need to be able to determine whether individuals have actually got enough information to make informed choices. In terms of strengthening quality in the tertiary sector, this is something that's always been important. It was important to the board when it was the Skills Australia board, and it's still equally important. We need high quality delivery of education in both vet and higher education sectors that has the confidence of Australian employers and individuals in the community. One of the things we're concerned about is the downward trend in funding per student contact hour in vet, and that we believe that warrants further investigation in relation to quality. And we've established a couple of principles that we think here might help to strengthen quality. One is, and they're both really meant to address high-risk qualifications. One is to suggest that we insist upon externally set and administered external assessments as a capstone at the end of somebody's qualification. And the other is some criteria that we want to put in place for RTOs offering qualifications in high-risk areas, for example, in training and assessment. So you can see some of those there, that they not be holding provisional registration, that they've already got a track record, and that perhaps they're delivering other qualifications before they move into those more high-risk ones. So really we're talking about a suite of measures that will position Australia to meet our future workforce and skills development needs, no matter what the future holds. And perhaps we can go to questions.
Excellent, thanks Kathy. I just wondered, are you able to make a comment about how the work that you're doing in relation to quality is feeding into, ASQA and TEXA, and also some of the state reforms, where things like external validation is being managed more in a contractual sort of way with the implementation of the national entitlement model?
I'm going to pass that question to Robin, so if you don't mind unmuting Robin so that he can deal with that one.
Yep, sure thing. Thanks, Robin.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Well, I suppose that the main route that we have is through influence. And clearly our board is a very high-powered board. We have two members of the Reserve Bank. Our chair is the ex-CEO of IBM, and we have the ex-CEO of Woodside Petroleum on the board. And we've made a number of direct recommendations in this area. In both skills for prosperity and future focus, we've talked about the need for external validation, and we were really pleased to see that, and it came through a consultation that we did in the last national agreement, and from that came those trials about external validation. We were also pleased to see in the consultation paper from the NSSC that they talked about validation, and there's lots of good things in that paper, but we were a bit disappointed that they didn't want to implement some of our recommendations until the trials have been over in 2015 and 16, run by the states. Another of our recommendations that we've consistently said in all our reports is that purchasers, have the right to put contractual conditions. So, for example, if a state has an entitlement system, it can still have an approved provider list. And I think South Australia does this, and providers would have to meet certain criteria over and above being an RTO in order to get on that list. So individuals and industries and enterprises could actually pick their provider, but the providers on the list would have to make higher criteria as specified by the state. So we are in constant dialogue with all these policy bodies, and we are also in constant dialogue with the Ministerial Council and other bodies about implementing the recommendations that have come through our research and through our extensive consultation and feedback with the field. We certainly have some dialogue with ASQA, but it wouldn't be appropriate for us to get involved in any operational things with ASQA. So we don't comment on individual providers, but only on systemic issues.
Thanks, Robin. And I threw that question in. I thought I can't let you guys off this easily, but that seems to have kicked off a few now. So I've got a question here, and it's from Liz Willers, and she's from TAFE New South Wales New England Institute. So let me just relay it to you. She says, how do new economy skills requirements fit into the concepts model? So that was from your earlier slides.
Well, when we were doing the scenarios, we did hold a seminar with the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia. and we got leading thinkers to identify some of the drivers in the future workforce and the future economy. That paper is available, like all our papers, off our website. And the future of work in the new economy is something that we're very concerned about. And some people on the webinar might have attended our conference like last year on the future of work, where we had people like Linda Grattan and Hugh Lauder, who talked about, you know, how the new economy might plan out. I mean, Linda Grattan's got this sort of vision where for some of us, or more of us, you know, we'll all be independent contractors working at home, buying and selling off giant eBay systems. And she thinks that's a good thing because we'll have more control and more autonomy. Other people think that's a more uncertain world. You know, clearly I feel a bit like Donald Rumsfeld here and saying there are known knowns and unknown knowns and unknown unknowns. So, you know, things can happen that we can't predict. But in most cases, the way the economy adjusts to them is that the early adopters have, you know, specific generic and technical skills that enable them to do that. And then the education and training system, you know, when those have been bedded down slightly, makes formal qualifications. So, I mean, I think if we have a high standard of education and training and people have the requisite generic skills, I think we can cope with it at the early stages, but then the education and training system has to respond to it in a formal way soon after the early adopters have actually established the new products and services in the marketplace. But yes, it's something that we're constantly looking at, and also as part of our scenarios development, which aren't just economic, we did engage two futurists, which was an interesting exercise to actually help us crystallize some of the current trends.
Thanks, Robin. And there's a couple of questions from Annie Payne and also from May online. They're really interested in what you're saying in relation to career advice, and what have you got in mind around addressing that?
Well, we think career advice is crucial for a whole variety of reasons. One, if you're going to have an entitlement system, people need good careers advice so they're making informed decisions. And the other issue is, if we're all going to have multiple careers over our lifetime, two things need to happen. That the careers advice needs to be not just for people who are at school and going on to higher education or going on to work. It needs to be a lifelong service. But we also think, though it's perfectly legitimate for educational providers to have careers advice, we also think there needs to be some independence in the careers advice that is available to people, because obviously educational providers have got an interest in selling the courses and the programs that they're running. So our advice to government is that they need to beef up careers advice. It needs to be lifelong and it needs to be independent. It's quite interesting if you have a look at other countries. The German equivalent of the old CES, besides employing 100,000 people in terms of job placement, also provides lifelong careers advisory services. And though they've actually wound it back because of their budgetary situation, in the UK they used to have the Independent Connection Service. So, and this was mainly for young people, but every young person between the ages of 16 and 19 certainly had a career advisor who was independent of the educational institution. And interestingly, they provided not only advice about occupations and occupational, careers, but also things about student grants. And indeed, if a young person was homeless, things like homelessness remediation options as well. So our basic message to government is that we need to beef up careers advice, make it lifelong, and make it independent.
Thanks, Robin. I think we'll just take one more question before we hear from Jacinta, and then we'll come back to answer some more if that's okay with you. We had a question from Kay, and she's interested to know what are some of the other high-risk qualifications aside from the certificate for in training and assessment or education. So what are the other high-risk qualifications?
Well, if I could explain, that was the one that was always mentioned to us. In fact, when we were doing our consultation, a number of people suggested that if we sorted that one out, we'd sort out all the issues with quality in the whole vet sector. And you know, I have to say that was a consistent theme as raised all the way through. The other high-risk qualifications at one level are those ones that might have a licensing or regulation requirement. I mean, it's very interesting that if you take the Civil Aviation Authority, they actually do licensing for people like pilots and aero engineers, and though their examination system is very modern and very thorough, it's moderated and validated, they say it's such high risk that they have the old-fashioned concept of externally set and externally marked examinations. Now, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that you could do that throughout the vet sector, but it's interesting that they say in a high-risk area, to achieve consistency, irrespective of what provider you've been to in terms of your pilot training or associated aero, you're going to have to take an assessment which is set and marked by the same people to achieve consistency. And it's interesting that they justify that on the basis of the risk given the safety requirements in their industry. So, I mean, I would argue that many qualifications are high risk, and eventually we want a system whereby we have rigour in the delivery of all our qualifications, because one of the issues that we face is if we have inconsistency and some certificate 3s are not of the same standard as other, the whole system gets undermined.
Thanks, Robin. I really appreciate you taking those questions for us. And so now what we're going to do, I believe, is hand over to Jacinta, and Jacinta's going to talk about your sectoral research. So, Robin, I'll just pop you back on mute for a moment. And Jacinta, I've just unmuted your mic, so please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. If you could just advance to our one and only slide about our research. When the government established the agency in terms of expanding on the role previously undertaken by Skills Australia, one of the new tasks we were given was to provide independent advice on sectoral skills needs to support the workforce development planning and productivity, including in small business. In order to do this, we're now undertaking a number of sectoral studies this year, which you can see listed on the slide there. The aim of the studies is to identify factors impacting the selected industries, to analyse the demand for an expected supply of skilled labour, and to analyse the evidence of over and under supply in key occupations in these industries. The studies will also make recommendations and propose strategies to address workforce development issues raised in the studies both now and into the future. So with each of the studies that you can see there on the screen, within the context of those, we'll be considering 5 key themes throughout the reports, and those themes are demographic issues, specifically Australia's ageing population, the opportunities arising from the Asian century, restructuring of the economy and emerging industries, human capital and opportunities for reskilling, and technology in terms of how new technology is being applied in the industry sectors, the risks and opportunities presented by this, and what it means for skill formation. So to give you a bit of an update on where we are at with each of those studies, in relation to the Information and Communication Technology study, we're in the final stages of preparing our report for that study, which we expect to present to the government in June. In relation to the food industry study, an issues paper was recently released, which is available on the AWPA website, and interested parties have until the 7th of June to make submissions in response to that issues paper. This report is expected to be presented to the government in August. There's a scoping paper that's been prepared for our retail sector workforce study, and an issues paper to inform the development of a final report is currently being drafted. The issues paper is expected to be available in July. The agency is also undertaking a study on the manufacturing workforce at the request of the Prime Minister, and work on this has commenced this month. This report is expected to be presented to the government in September. In terms of future work that we've planned, we're also expecting to undertake studies on the engineering and accounting workforces. These two studies will complete the work we started on the professional, technical and scientific services sector, which we started with the ICT study. These two studies will commence in the second half of this year. In addition to these sectors that have been identified for analysis this year, we're also undertaking an annual report on the resources sector skills needs, which is something that we do every year for government. This is in response to a recommendation of the National Resources Sector Employment Task Force report, and the government's request that we provide a report on the status of skill shortages in the resources sector each year. The 2013 report is currently being prepared and will be the agency's third such report. The report will draw on a range of quantitative and qualitative data and involve extensive consultation with relevant industry and non-industry stakeholders from across Australia. This year's report will also expand on previous reports to include emerging workforce issues in the sector, and will include both a macro and micro view of what is happening across the economy. There is a reference group for this, as there are for all our studies, which guides the preparation of the report. This report is expected to be presented to the government in September. So that, in a nutshell, is what we're doing in relation to our sectoral research this year.
Fabulous. Thanks, Jacinta. Really appreciate you giving us a summary of this. And how could people sort of keep up to date with what's happening, or, particularly if they have an interest in a certain sector? What do you suggest?
Well, as Robin mentioned earlier, we sort of publish all our papers and publications on the AWPA website, and if you go to the AWPA website, there's a section that will take you through to our sectoral research, and generally for each of the studies we've got a page established on which we post information about consultations and just the purpose of the studies, and sort of whatever issues papers or final reports that we're in the process or have delivered, so people can keep an eye on that. I believe stuff also gets fed out through our Twitter feed, is that right? Yeah, so things like that, and we're also planning this year to sort of have a bit of media, I guess, around each of these studies when we're releasing them, because each report, when it's completed, is presented to the government.
Excellent. Thanks, Jacinta. I would think that particularly if people are online where they're providers, this sort of information would give them great insight, help them with their product and service design, and also looking at opportunities. So thank you so much. And we've got about 15 minutes left for the session today. So Robin, I'm going to come back to some of the questions, if that's okay with you. I'll just unmute your mic again, Robin, and feel free if you want to pass on any of these questions to perhaps a colleague, or you might even want to take some of these potentially on notice. I've got a question here from Keith Reynolds from Norgrove Training, and he asked, why external validation when we are so heavily regulated with ASQA in this area? Do you want to take that question?
Well, I think it's about third-party endorsement. I mean, what we're not suggesting that every assessment is externally validated, but I think a sample of assessments from each provider every year, it does ensure that consistency. The alternative is to do what CASA does and get people to set externally marked and externally set examinations. It's quite interesting, in the school sector, for example, irrespective of whether you go to a GPS private school, your local comprehensive, or a Catholic school, you all take, the same course, and you'll get a credential not awarded by the school but awarded by the relevant Board of Studies, and there is a degree of moderation and validation, and there doesn't appear to be quite the same range of issues in terms of questioning the variability in those types of assessments that you get in the vet sector. I've run 2 educational institutions, and certainly in the UK, for every course that we ran, we used to have external validators come in. So, for example, we used to do an electrical installation course, and we have external validation here, but the process was in the UK, was City and Guilds would send a subject expert round to every provider, public and private, once a year, and what they would do is ask either to sit on a practical assessment or alternatively say to a provider, can you give me the assessments from this group, and I want to see Joe Bloggs, Mary Smith and Hamish McTavish's assessment. And the fact that it was a subject expert and the fact that there was this validation certainly led to the credibility. And if you go to the university sector, for example, if you go to Sydney University's website, you will see that they have external examiners come in who will also look at their assessment for degrees, and they will actually report publicly whether they think that the assessment was fair and valid. So I think in the vet sector we need to do that to make sure that the public and most importantly the industry has got confidence in our assessments. Not that we do everyone, but I certainly think it'd be an assessment. And in terms of regulation, it's all very variable. Not that I'm advocating it is, but the regulation of a UK provider is far, far, far tougher than what we experience here. Now that might not be a good thing, but on the other hand, they don't seem to have the same quality issues.
Thanks, Robin. I appreciate your response there. We've got a question from Ian Newton, who's from TAFE New South Wales North Coast Institute. Do you see a link between digital literacy and productivity as distinct from traditional language literacy and numeracy skills?
Well, hello, Ian. Yes, I was in the North Coast Institute once, and it's great to hear from you. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of we can put the capital investment into new bits of equipment, but if people can't use them, that investment is going to either go to waste or not be utilised as much as it should do. So, I mean, I think all aspects of education and training can have a productivity payoff, and that's possibly true even when you're doing a specific occupational study. You're also going to pick up generic skills. So, we would advocate that digital literacy is a key critical skill for the future and one that needs to be nurtured and enhanced. So, and it also enables people to be more innovative as well. So, yes, I would totally agree.
Thanks, Robin. And I've got a question here from Angie Tarras. She says, in the UK 20 years ago, the government funded tertiary system to introduce work-based learning and to ensure the interface between learning at work and the higher education articulation. Has this model been considered as the solution to make the tertiary system here more adaptive? And I think you partly answered that before, but I wondered if you wanted to comment on whether or not, particularly with your experience, we're going to be seeing a number of the things from the UK system feature here in Australia.
Well, there's lots in the UK system we wouldn't want to translate here, and policy tourism is always a bit dangerous because there's different context. I think the fundamental issue about the UK is that they have a hard distinction between what we would call vet and what we would call higher education. For example, in the UK, everything above level 3 is considered higher education, whereas in Australia we've got diplomas and advanced diplomas which overlap with associate degrees, but one's vet and one's higher education, one's competency-based and one's not. Whereas if you were running in a TAFE college in the UK, everything above Cert 3 wouldn't be funded by the vet system, it would be funded by the higher education system. Now, that has its pluses and minuses. In one ironical way, it actually makes articulation and credit transfer an awful lot easier because, if you're articulating from a level 4 or 5 qualification or a level 5-6 qualification in the UK, something like the old Higher National Certificate, which is equivalent to our advanced diploma, it's easier because they're both classified as higher education along with degrees. So you haven't got the situation we've got where you've got a competency-based training package diploma trying to articulate into a curriculum-based associate degree. But, you know, there are pluses and minuses. If you're going to have that hard distinction as well, it complicates the funding regime because it means that providers who straddle the vet higher education divide would have to deal with a number of different agencies, but I suppose they do already. But can I say that's not going to happen here because higher education is fundamentally the responsibility of the Commonwealth Government, and vet is fundamentally the responsibility of state governments. And I know the Commonwealth does fund some programs in vet, but fundamentally it's a state government responsibility. And given the fact that Victoria and Western Australia didn't want to reserve their powers for ASQA, I can't see them wanting to hand over vet to the Commonwealth, although you never know in the future with what might happen.
Fair enough. Thank you, Robin. We had a question from Pippa, and she was from Regional Development Australia, basically making the comment that particularly Regional Development Australia boards around Australia and councils and other providers are getting involved in regional workforce planning and development. How can they connect in with AWPA better and work with you?
Well, the first issue, I suppose, to say is that we take a national perspective, and each state does its own regional workforce development activities. I'm on a national principal committee with the states where we're looking at the linkages between Commonwealth responsibilities, national responsibilities, us with certain states. I have to be careful here, but I'll have to say it varies very much state by state. Certainly I know if you're in Western Australia, they have invested an awful lot into regional workforce development and regional workforce development planning, and they've worked with their local associations and bodies such as councils. And on our website there is some information also about a seminar we held with the states, and we run a practitioner group where the states and AWPA meet to have a look about how we can actually synergise with one another and how we can support one another. Though I would have to say, for example, sometimes when I make a presentation in, I don't know, Queensland, and people will say to me, well, what about workforce development planning in the Bowen Basin? I mean, I'd have to say that AWPA sets a national scene, whereas we don't do specific things on a regional level. We would leave that to the states and people like Regional Development Australia itself. But there is this community of practice, and if anybody would like to contact us, we can put them in touch with the people in their states who come to those community of practice meetings. Certainly in New South Wales there's people like Sue Baird, and in Western Australia it's Gary Jackson, but we can make those names available if people would like to contact them.
Thanks, Robin. We've got about 4 minutes left. I'm just wondering if we could do perhaps 2 or 3 more quick questions, and then we'll sort of wrap up. I have a question here from Kay McCulloch, which might be yourself or Jacinta, and she asked whether or not you've researched needs in the aged care sector.
The short answer to that is no. We haven't specifically looked at the aged care sector, but if you look at some of our modelling, it will reflect that. But could I say that I know the Productivity Commission has done some work in this area, and also the Community Services Health ISC has also done some work in this area. But Jacinta might want to provide some further information.
Hi, Robin. No, I've got nothing further to add other than to confirm that, no, we haven't undertaken this work, and certainly the Productivity Commission undertook quite an extensive investigation of that sector. So yeah, nothing more to say.
Thank you. And Robin, I've got a question here, and it's from David Finesse, and he's from Defeast in South Australia, working in a regional location, beautiful Fleurieu Peninsula and Adelaide Hills. He's asking why registered training organisations aren't necessarily required to include work placement and competency assessment prior to gaining a qualification. This would ensure RTO's training is current and the needs are met. So I guess he's sort of saying, why isn't that sort of mandatory, whereas some providers can still use simulated environments, for example?
Well, I think, that's an interesting point, and I don't want to duck it, but, I think that's an issue for two bodies. One is the National Skills Standards Council. My board will make some recommendations based on our feedback, but it's the National Skills Standards Council that is responsible for setting standards nationally in terms of the vet sector. The other issue is that my understanding under Skills for All in South Australia, the state government could actually require providers who got on its Skills for All list to actually meet those additional requirements. So, the two avenues would be either the National Skills Standards Council or your state government in terms of when they specify what providers are going to get on their list to be eligible to enrol people through entitlement funding.
Thanks, Robin. And we need to wrap it up.
I would just add.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, certainly we're strong advocates of work experience internships because it helps break down the skills experience gap.
Excellent. So we're just going to move on. I know you've got a video that we wanted to offer people the opportunity to view. I haven't tweeted today yet, Robin, but I will do about the webinar. Do you want to say something just on this final slide, Robin?
I'll just say thanks very much, and we try and make everything available on our website. Whenever we do a new policy, we do hold consultation meetings in every state. We try to go to regional areas like Newcastle and Geraldton, Bunbury, and we're always very keen to get feedback from the field. And thank you very much, Wendy, for allowing us to take over one of your webinars.
Thanks, Robert. And can I just also put forward my thank you to your team. It's been excellent working with them as well and getting this webinar up and happening, particularly with such a huge number of people online. We appreciate the fact that you accepted our invitation to host the webinar, and I really think that today's session has been incredibly useful for people. And so can I say thank you to Robin, to Kathy and to Jacinta, and a special thank you as well to Trish, who's helped do a lot of setup, and also to Scott on my team. So I think now we're going to move to the final slide, which is the video. And just as a reminder to everybody, you'll get the recording once we've edited it after a day or two, and also hopefully a link to Robin's slides, but I'll just check that out with him. Thanks everybody. Please hang around to see the video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.